Hello, I'm Susan Ouellette. I'm a professor of history and American studies at St. Michael's College, and I'm going to talk with you today about the history of the American Revolution, especially from the perspective of an ordinary person, or as much as anyone could be ordinary. I'm currently working on a biography of a gentleman who lived in the Champlain Valley in the period of the American Revolution and was drawn into it, not because of a political um, inclination. Rather, he got drawn into the revolution in a way that, especially to the independent side, because of the circumstances that he found himself in. And so that's really the purpose of this talk today. First of all, the mythology of the American Revolution that has been promulgated as part of our creation story has generally held that most Americans, or most American colonists, became patriots. They hated being taxed. The British were engaged in predatory practices, whether those were economic or taxation, or at some level they were not respectful of American rights and our citizenship as members of the British realm. Well, it is true that a goodly number of Americans did become patriots and were engaged in trying to resist the royal and monarchical rule of England. But the enthusiastic engagement of Americans in a revolution that created the nation was not so widespread, nor was it so enthusiastic as the mythology would have us believe. And so here is where the story of someone like William Gilliland can be instructive. And he was not alone. In fact, a rather cantankerous clergyman in Boston made the comment that the revolution made no difference to him, and essentially the way Mather Biles was his name, the way he described it was, what difference would it make to have one tyrant 3,000 miles away or 3,000 tyrants a mile away? It would not affect his life. Patriots were, to say the least, Sons of Liberty, especially, to say the least, were not very happy to hear him express those sentiments. William Gilliland was a person who, first of all, he had emigrated to the colonies in the period of the French and Indian War. He became a merchant in New York City and was married well and was deeply involved in the economic life of the city. He's created at least 2 businesses and spun off a couple of more of them that he put his relatives in charge of. He actually brought some of his family from, originally he was from Ireland, from Northern Ireland, and he brought some of his family with him and helped to get them set up in the New World. At the end of the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War, at the time that the Proclamation of 1763 was created, which essentially established how the colonies were going to be managed after the French were essentially disenfranchised in North America. A codicil to that proclamation made land available to soldiers who had fought, British soldiers in particular, who had fought in the war in North America and decided to stay there. And so the proclamation basically outlined an opportunity for these soldiers to get land through the auspices of the colonial government of whatever province that they lived in. So in William Gilliland's case, the governor of New York, the provincial governor of New York, was in a position to actually grant land to former soldiers. And as soldiers began to approach him and request land being given to them, Gilliland began to buy up soldiers' land claims. Now, from the point of view of the people who saw this as entrepreneurial and American, I would say that it was less American entrepreneurial and more about what many British citizens had been doing in the colonies for some time, gathering together land, recruiting tenants for the land, and essentially creating a manor. And certainly there are lots of examples of this in New York and Massachusetts, especially Western Massachusetts. And Gilliland was following their lead. So over a fairly short period of time between 1763, when the proclamation was issued, and 1765, when he actually embarked on creating his community, he gathered up these various soldiers' claims, put them together, and at one point laid a claim for something on the order of 50,000 acres between what is now Crown Point and the Canadian border on the western side of Lake Champlain. And that's where he established his community, about halfway between those 2 points. He recruited tenants. He actually came and decided to be a resident squire of his new manor. The first year that he was in residence, so to speak, was 1765. He brought a group of tenants, prospective tenants, several slaves that belonged to him. They built a manor house, and the following year, in 1766, he brought his family from New York, his wife and his children, and they proceeded to settle in this manor house. Between 1766 and 1775, he engaged in commerce, mostly connected with Montreal and the region of habitants and French, the French who were left behind and were allowed to stay by the Quebec Act in Canada. And he also engaged in a variety of economic activities with the especially when Crown Point and Ticonderoga were reinvigorated by first by the British and then eventually by the Americans. He engaged in commerce with them, providing food, mainly salmon, for instance. One of the first things that he did in establishing his home on the Ouellette River is he dynamited a channel in the bedrock that the river had exposed, and he created a salmon catch. And he literally provided pounds and pounds and pounds of salmon to the forts as food for the soldiers. In 1775, as things began to change in the Champlain Valley in response to events that had begun to happen in other areas, the Boston Massacre had been earlier, the unrest in the port cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, especially Boston, began to filter into the Champlain Valley as a sort of a distant echo. People were aware that there were these things going on, but because of the nature of the life in the Champlain Valley focused northward into British Canada, there was perhaps some concern, but not a great deal of concern until in May of 1775, the Americans decided to take the Fort Ticonderoga. Now, the story of the taking of Fort Ticonderoga is a very complicated one, and I won't go into huge details here, but suffice it to say that several groups converged on the fort, wrested it out of the control of a very small British force, and established themselves as an American presence, a patriotic, quote unquote, American presence on Lake Champlain and in the valley. Gilliland approached this in a very different way. He did not say that he was supportive of the Americans of the fort, although later in retrospect, he did talk about the fact that he encouraged Benedict Arnold in his initial assessment of the fort as being an important strategic point. But mainly, he was interested in staying neutral, or neuter, as he often would write in his letters. So, as the Americans begin to try to create a stronger hold on the Champlain Valley, understanding it as a strategic place, Gilliland continued to do business both northwards with the British and southwards with the Americans. Now, what this did was put him in a position of being suspected on both sides as of being a spy. So rather than living up to his hope that he would be seen as a neutral figure who could do business with both sides, they began, but from both sides, to look at him with a very jaundiced eye. In Canada, Guy Carleton, the Governor General of the province, basically of the province of what they call Upper Canada, began to look suspiciously every time Gilliland or Gilliland's men showed up in the north at what they were doing, and suspected that they were using their economic transactions to suss out supplies, men, military arrangements, and all the rest of it that the British were engaged in. When Gilliland or his men or both would go to Crown Point or Ticonderoga, they were suspected of doing the same thing on behalf of the British. Carleton moved first on this. He issued an arrest warrant for Gilliland and sent a group of men led by a sheriff from Tryon County to actually kidnap him, rendition him to Canada, to force him both to stop spying for the Americans, but also to make a point that the British were not going to allow this kind of behavior. Unluckily for Sheriff White and his group, when they arrived at Gilliland's home, unbeknownst to them, there were several young officers from Fort Ticonderoga who were visiting with Gilliland and had been sent there by Philip Schuyler, who was now in charge of the forts, to ask Gilliland if he would consider loaning them the boats, the small boats that he had his carpenter building for moving goods and things around the Champlain Valley on the lake. So when these men sort of burst in to try and take control of Gilliland, Americans were there to sort of foil the plot. And instead they were captured, taken prisoner, and sent to for Ticonderoga for their own rendition. At this point, Gilliland, I think, began to suspect that he was probably going to have to make some kind of a choice. But he dithered about it for a while longer. And then Arnold, who had been put in charge of the military, especially the naval military advancements that the Americans wanted to make on the lake, began to make demands of him as well. And he realized that remaining neutral was going to be more and more dangerous. And although he tried, eventually, in the fall of 1775, he was arrested, this time by the Americans, hauled off to Ticonderoga to be renditioned himself. He was at Fort Ticonderoga during the Battle of Valcourt. After that, he was ordered to take his family and to vacate the Champlain Valley, which he did. He moved back to Albany, where he had some economic ties. And at that point, he realized that, in fact, he really had to make a choice. And so his public speech and his written letters and various other pieces of evidence show that he very reluctantly began to support the American Revolution. But again, this was less a political choice, certainly not an ideological choice. Instead, it was far more of a personal choice. If he wanted his family to continue to prosper, if he wanted to be able to stay out of jail, if he wanted to be able to marry his daughters. At this point, he had 3 teenage daughters. If he wanted his daughters to marry and move in American society with any sort of respectability, he was going to have to accept that the Patriots, insofar as the area around Albany, were in fact in charge. And so through the period of the war, when he lived in Albany, although he himself didn't partake in the war, at one point he does sort of become a militia leader, but it was a leader in name only. He was not, by the time of the American Revolution, he was in his 50s. And so he was not someone who would have been an active soldier to any great degree. And he didn't want to be. This wasn't something that he was interested in. I think he had enough influence that had he really desired it, he probably could have gotten some sort of a commission. But instead, he spent the entire war arguing with the commissioner of the Northern Department over whether they paid him enough money for the food that he supplied to the army, or when the representatives of the Continentals went around the Champlain Valley in anticipation of Burgoyne's movement down into the valley to invade and perhaps cut New England off from New York. The Continentals went around and basically confiscated everything that farmsteads had, including their cattle. And so, again, another loss for Gilliland. So at the end of the war, Gilliland found himself both impoverished because so much of what he had owned and had produced over the years of the war, and even just prior to the war, that had been commandeered by the Continental Army, went unpaid. And in addition, his lack of enthusiasm for the patriot cause made him a suspect figure, and it probably affected his ability to lay claim to the lands that he thought he owned. So instead of 50,000 acres, he ended up in control of about 5,000, which is still a pretty substantial property. And his children benefited from his efforts. But his desire to create an English style manor in the Champlain Valley failed. And as did Philip Skane's attempt to create a manor. And all of those efforts failed largely because the war came to the Champlain Valley. And I really believe that had that not been the case, Willsboro and William Gilliland would have been a very different kind of place. So I consider him to be a practical patriot rather than an ideological one, pragmatic even when he needed to be. And I think that he had far more in common with most Americans than with the Sons of Liberty, who were sort of the symbol, if you will, of the patriotic cause. Thank you very much.